Tuesday, October the 4th, 2022, and welcome back to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm the Vincent van Gogh Fellow here at the Hoover Institution. But the one good ear that I do have, I will be listening intently to the stars of our show, the GoodFellows as we refer to them. That would be the historian Niall Ferguson, the economist John Cochrane, the geostrategist Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. They are Hoover Institution Senior Fellows all. And joining us today to round out a conversation about America's political landscape, no better person to turn to than Karl Rove. Karl Rove is, of course, one of America's most preeminent political strategists and consultants. He writes an always insightful column for the Wall Street Journal that you should read. And in case you're not aware of political details, he earned the nickname The Architect. It was given to him by no less than President George W. Bush on the occasion of President Bush being reelected. Karl, if I have my history right, that is the only time that an American president has lost a popular vote, but then been reelected 4 years later. Karl, welcome to GoodFellows.
Did you hear the one about the economist, the general, and the historian who walk into a bar and meet a political hack? I mean, what is this going on? Also, don't get carried away with the architect label. He also called me Turd Blossom, which was the nickname that he gave me whenever I was right. He knew it and didn't want to admit it. So good nicknames come with bad ones too.
Hey, but architect it's a coveted title, right? I remember George Costanza on Seinfeld, Art Vandelay, the architect.
I like Art Vandelay. Art Vandelay? He's an obscure writer.
It was one of his personas.
I keep getting letters from state architectural boards saying, stop using the title. You're not accredited in our state.
Karl, before I hand you over to Neil, John, and HR, let me ask you this question. Would you solve a mystery for me? If the House goes Republican next month, which odds are it will, that will mark, Karl, the sixth time in the last 9 congressional elections. It dates back to 2006 when you're in the White House, but 6 of the last 9 congressional elections, at least one chamber of Congress has changed, party hands. What's going on here? Is the problem the men and women we're sending to Washington, Karl? Is the problem with America's political parties, or does the fault lie in the American voter who seems to be especially fickle these days?
Well, it's interesting. Go back to the last time this happened, the Gilded Age, after the election of 1872 and the re-election of Ulysses S. Grant. For the next quarter of a century, we have 5 presidential elections in a row in which nobody gets 50% of the vote. We have 2 years of Republican president, House, and Senate, 2 years of a Democratic president, House, and Senate, and the rest of the time there's divided government, starting with the capture of the House in 1874 by the Democrats for the first time in 18 years, and what's called the victory of the Brigadiers, because so many former Confederate officers are elected. So I think there's some similarities between our time and the Gilded Age, because politics was fundamentally broken then. We had intense two-party competition, in part because white Democrats in the South were wiping out the black Republican vote on a scale that's impossible for the modern mind to really get its hands around. But we had intense partisan competition, and there was a constant change in the control of the House of Representatives and the election of the only Democrat twice between James Buchanan and FDR, actually, and Woodrow Wilson. So, we're broken. Our politics are broken like they were in the Gilded Age. And as a result, we're likely to see the House flip again this next time because with a 5-vote margin and a midterm election after this election of a Democratic president, it's hard to believe that they're going to be able to hold on.
I'm highly sympathetic to your analogy with the Gilded Age. I've said for a while that American politics is only shocking if you don't know anything about the 19th century. But it's a very 19th century environment in Washington and around the country. And of course, the Gilded Age conjures up recollections of the inequality of that time. But how does this end? Because if I remember rightly, you get the progressive era at the end of the Gilded Age, and you also get a breakdown of the two-party system. Do you think anything of that sort is conceivable? I could imagine a breakdown of the two-party system, but I've been saying that for years and it doesn't happen.
Well, I'm not certain I share the view that this leads to the progressive era. What leads to the progressive era is the assassination of a moderate conservative president in the form of William McKinley and his replacement by the wild man, Theodore Roosevelt. That's also, I wouldn't suggest, I mean, there's a year outside of the presidential election of 1912 and 1916, we have a 30 some odd year period of Republican dominance at all levels. The 1920s are the last time that there are 4,000 Republican state legislators and less than 3,000 Democratic state legislators, for example. So again, I think it's the serenity of that 30 some odd year period between 1896 and 1932 is interrupted by an exuberant personality who decides that he's going to go in a slightly different direction, and then in 1912 decides that his chosen successor is not worthy of the office, and that the people are clamoring for his return. So other than that, though, if you look at the Congress and the governorships and state legislative races, there's a Republican dominance at all levels that exists for 30 some odd years.
Mm-hmm. John?
I was just wondering whether the fundamental thing is not just partisanship, but the incompetence. Each party comes in and promptly does things that the majority of the electorate didn't want them to do. So naturally they turn on them. But I think we've hit to a broader theme rather than that one, which is, I think, where we'd like to go. I'm very worried by the falling apart of the norms, the escalating tit for tat. We've seen it most recently in the new tactic is to proclaim the previous administration illegitimate. Unfortunately, Republicans don't have much of a leg to stand on complaining about the Democrats inventing that one, now complaining the Supreme Court is illegitimate. So there is a point at which each battle becomes a scorched earth affair, and the whole thing goes downhill.
Well, again, I hate to say we've been there before, but we have. I mean, think about this. Remember last year, 2021, the House of Representatives said, Mariana Meeks got elected in Iowa by 7 votes. Maybe we ought to have a committee look into seeing if that election was entirely legitimate. And after a few days, they said, well, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't, because the last time we did that was 1974 in the bloody 7th of Indiana, and we kicked out a Republican who'd gotten elected and certified and replaced him with his Democrat opponent in a narrow election, and it poisoned the well in the House for 10 years. For a better part of a decade, people were still fighting over that. Think about this: between 1875 and 1902, how many times do you think the majority party in the House of Representatives picked out a member of the minority who'd gotten reelected by a narrow margin and replaced him, kicked him out, phoned up an election challenge and kicked him out? Want to hazard a guess? 1875, 1902. What's your number? Cochrane, what's your number?
This is what I love about you, by the way. I'm just going to interject. You know every fact there ever is to be known about American politics.
All right, you're avoiding the question, but I'm
avoiding the question.
55 times.
Wow.
55 times. And in fact, in 1884, the reform-minded member from Northeast Ohio, who'd won re-election in the previous 1882 midterms by 50 votes, William McKinley, is kicked out by the Democratic majority. And the only unusual thing about it is that 7 Democrats, including the first Democratic speaker in 18 years, Randall of Pennsylvania, vote to retain him as a mark of respect for him. The fever is finally broken in 1902 when a Democrat from Colorado listens intently to the committee hearing on the election challenge to his election, stands up on the floor of the House and says, I've paid close attention to the evidence that has been laid out, and it is clear to me that I was elected on the basis of fraud. And I ask all the members of the House to join me today in voting to expel me and replace me with my Republican opponent, who was actually duly elected. 2 years later, he won the election for governor of Colorado on the slogan of Honest John. But I mean, look, we are broke. We were broken then. And I mean, we're broken today. I agree with you. I worry about the norms, but let's not kid ourselves. You want to go through the election of 1876? I mean, my God, senators from New Hampshire carrying, suitcases full of money to Florida to make certain that everything is greased. I mean, it was a remarkable election, and lots of norms were challenged then. And again, what happens is the good common sense of the American people ultimately makes itself expressed, as it was in the election of 1896, and things sort of get back into the normal track of things. But yeah, our politics is broken. And don't get me started on election deniers. I had to go through 2000 and 2004. And I remember in 2005, these lunatics on the House of Representatives floor talking about how Ohio had been stolen from John Kerry by computer servers, flipping votes from Kerry to Bush, and alleging that there was a whistleblower to this whole affair, a Republican political consultant whom I ordered to be killed. He died in an airplane crash. He was a solo pilot, and he was flying his little plane back from Washington, D.C. And literally a lawsuit was filed in Ohio that alleged that I'd ordered his murder. So, and guess what? The election deniers were people like James Clyburn, the third ranking member of the House, two current committee chairs, and the sainted John Lewis of Georgia were all election deniers. And so I was one of the first people to say all this stuff about the 2020 election. I wrote a column in November that said, this is not going to change the election. This is ridiculous. And of course, I got excoriated by a guy who's now living in Bedminster, New Jersey, and Palm Beach. But we've been through this before in certain
But
ways.
in the modern, I'll just follow up and then give HR a turn. There was plenty of election shenanigans in the old days, and you fight by means legal and illegal. But I get a sense that the firm tactic of saying this current incumbent is illegitimate and therefore that justifies all means, legal and illegal, of opposing him or I guess her. That seems newer than just a little bit of shenanigans in the election.
Well, I'm not certain it was a little bit of shenanigans in the elections. I mean, think about this. 1896, a majority of the eligible voters in the state of Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina are black men who are overwhelmingly Republican. And the best that out of those three states that William McKinley can get is 24% of the vote in Louisiana. In Mississippi, where 60%, nearly 60% of the eligible voters are black men, he gets 6% of the vote. So, there may be, the level of shenanigans may have been slightly higher than it is today. But am I worried about January 6th? Yeah. I mean, the whole idea, the notion of organizing whoever, a mob, or encouraging the mob, or believing that the vice president of the United States has the unilateral authority to kick out electoral college votes. These are all problematic, and you can't find an exact equivalent in the Gilded Age, though you can certainly find violence of a different nature.
Well, I was just going to say, Rutherford B. Hayes, he was in 1877, I think he withdrew the last federal troops from the South. And then you had the failure of Reconstruction. You had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow, as Karl said, based really on a racist ideology to exclude blacks from the American political system. And I think that, today we have other ideological problems, whether they're extreme left or extreme right, however you want to characterize these groups. And what's common is that they don't acknowledge the right of the others to have their vote, and to have their say in how we're governed. And it's this lack of confidence in our democratic processes and institutions, I think, is extremely dangerous, Karl. So I'd just like to ask you, how do we get out of this, right? How do we get out of this time in which really political leaders from both parties have compromised our principles, to score partisan political points, or to perpetuate conspiracy theories, or really to just undermine our confidence in who we are as Americans and in our democratic institutions and processes? What do we need?
Well, first, before I answer your question, may I say I hate to be critical, but you ought to find a way on the birthday of Rutherford B. Hayes to say something nice about him rather than to point to him as did you know that? Did you go out of your way simply because it's his birthday?
I didn't even know it was his birthday, Karl. I hate to admit it.
1822 or something like that. I mean, my God. I mean, and not only that, but he's a fellow veteran. My God. No, look, well, how did we get out of the violence of the Gilded Age? I mean, think about it. I mean, we got the famous moment in it's 1890. The Republicans have taken the House, the Senate, and the White House in 1888. They were civilized back then, so they swore in the Congress in March and then sent them home because there was no air conditioning. And in the fall of 1889, Democrats in the House, who are in a sort of similar today, there was a very strong Democratic majority and a very slim Republican majority edge in the House. The Democrats announced they're not going to answer the roll call in order to deny the House a quorum. And so they bring up a vote, they bring up a bill. Remember, we had the thing, we're going to shut down the government. Well, they'd bring up a bill back then and they'd have a vote on it. Democrats would lose. They'd say there's no quorum present. They'd call the roll. The Democrats wouldn't answer the roll call. There wouldn't be a quorum. And for the fall of 1889 and into 1890, not a single bill passes the House of Representatives. Finally, Speaker Thomas Brackett Reed has had enough of it. So he announces on one particular day they're going to have a vote. The vote is to expel a West Virginia Democrat who won election by 50 votes so they can pad their Republican majority. And he tells the sergeant at arms, take up station at the doors and don't allow a single member to get out of the House. And when they finish having the vote, a Democrat stands up from Kentucky, I believe it was, and says no quorum is present. And they call the roll. No Democrat answers the roll. There's no quorum. There's a lack of a quorum. And Reed turns to the clerk and says, the chair directs the clerk to show Mr. Jones present, Mr. Smith present, calls out the name of every Democrat on the floor of the House and show that they're present. There's a quorum. All hell breaks loose. Every Democrat runs for the doors. One Democrat gets out. Constantine August of Rusk County, Texas, beats the crap out of the sergeant at arms, uses his cowboy boots to kick out the slats of the door and make good his escape. You know, this kicks off a 3.5 month long, I think it's maybe 2.5 month long battle that ultimately ends in the Supreme Court as to whether or not the speaker has the right to do this. And they uphold the right of Czar Reed to do it. And during the debate, one of the Democrats stands up, again, another Texan. We're so contributing to the climate of the times. William Henry Howdy Martin of Athens points a bony finger at the speaker. He's a 6'6" tall, fought the entire Civil War with Hood's brigade. He turns to his fellow Democrats, points at Reed and says, if any member will order me to remove this dictator from his position of power upon the podium, I will do so by force forthwith. Reed says, the honorable gentleman from Texas is out of order. Martin is so pissed off the next day, he shows up, takes a seat on the floor of the House of Representatives right in front of the speaker, pulls out his 16-inch long Bowie knife and spends the entire day sharpening it on his boot sole in an attempt to menace Reed. So this goes on. This is the tone of the times. And what happens is in comes a guy, William McKinley, completely underappreciated today, and says, we're all in this together. And he makes an extraordinary effort to unify the country, both in his campaign and then as president. And we enter into a new part of politics where, the norms start to reassert themselves. And I think the same thing is going to happen here. We're going to have a president who really means it when he returns to the norms that we have been accustomed to in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early part of this century.
Karl, let me try something out on you. The missing variable in the conversation so far is the changing role of the United States in the world. It is not accidental that the move away from the toxic politics you're describing coincides with the advent of a global role for the United States. For some people, it's full-blooded American empire. It's more euphemistically phrased by Woodrow Wilson, but the real theme that takes us pretty much from the 1890s through to, I would say, George W. Bush is that American global power requires some level of bipartisanship because national security arguments are ultimately dominant when there's a crisis. Of course, it ebbs and flows, but pretty reliably, when the national security issue becomes dominant, as happened after 9/11, there's national unity. And that was a recurrent feature of the 20th century too. I wonder if that will happen again. Let me tell you some very recent history. 4 weeks ago, I was sitting listening to two senators, a Republican and a Democrat, talking about foreign policy. They were on foreign soil. We were in Italy. Lindsey Graham and Bob Menendez. And what struck me was that they had essentially a single bipartisan view on foreign policy, and specifically on the questions of China and Russia. And I wonder if what's really going to change, and maybe it's already happening, is that a consensus has emerged on foreign policy that is ending the chronic polarization that has characterized Washington in recent times. Do you see that? And if so, could it be the way that we get to higher levels of political cooperation, if not national unity?
Yeah, well, I think you put your finger on a very important thing. Look at the Semiconductor Bill, and I'm not going to defend each and every provision of it, but where did that come from? That came from a freshman Republican senator from Indiana named Todd Young, and a senior Democrat, Mark Warner, having conversations to say we have a concern, a mutual concern about our vulnerability in the age of the semiconductor to relying upon factories in Taiwan and China to potential Chinese domination of a strategic element. So I think you're right. The problem is that and I hope it goes along those lines. What I'm worried about is I see an element inside the Republican Party that is frankly apologist for Putin and neo-isolationist. And I think I see it today, a distinct minority inside the party, but I see it as a viable minority that could be problematic over the long haul.
But they look like they made a terrible bet. I mean, all those people who bet on Putin in Europe as well, on the populist right, look like they've just blown themselves up. And it's going to be a stain on their reputations that can never be effaced.
I hope so.
I mean, I'm struck by the continuities in foreign policy from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. This is part of the same story, that there hasn't really been a huge break in policy towards China. The attempt to break on the Middle East has basically failed. And do you see any signs of that bipartisanship I'm talking about?
Absolutely. And just on Carl's point about the CHIPS Act, that started as the America Competes Act under Senator Risch when the Republicans were in the minority in the Senate. It passed seamlessly over to Menendez. And then it went to the House and they shoveled a bunch of pork into it. And then a reconciliation, they saved it. And it's a net positive piece of legislation. So there are places where we can work together. And I'll tell you, when I was National Security Advisor, I really tried, for the brief period of time I was there, to foster a bipartisan approach to foreign policy, because I do think, and I'd love to hear Carl's thoughts on this, foreign policy, I guess, is the place to go to maybe reverse this polarization. Like, hey, who wants North Korea with the most destructive weapons on earth, firing missiles over Japan as they did a few days ago? I mean, who wants Vladimir Putin to be able to continue his destructive campaign in Ukraine and broadly, even more broadly? Who wants China's promotion of its authoritarian mercantilist model to succeed, right? Who wants Iran, to continue to subjugate brutally its own people as it's doing now, as well as continue its 4-decade plus proxy war against us? I mean, so I think that these are issues that we should be able to come together on. But I just think that you have to foster that at the highest levels of leadership, and I have not seen either President Biden be able to do it, and certainly, of course, President Trump was quite a polarizing figure on a number of levels. But Karl, is that viable? Do Americans even care about foreign policy anymore? I mean, is this a way to approach the polarization problem set?
Well, I think I don't know how interested most Americans are in foreign policy, but they do believe on some instinctive level, some gut level, that America has a special role to play in the world, and that we live in a global environment where we have to have friends and have to be concerned about what's abroad. That's why this enormous wave of support for Ukraine that you saw reflected in the polls was so strong. It was because of the gut instinct in the American people. I do, like you. I think I agree that this is an area that can help take some of the polarized nature of our politics out. I don't think, however, it's going to happen from the White House first and foremost. I think it's going to happen if the Republicans take the House, and if the Republicans take the Senate. If you've got Risch and McCall, Risch of Idaho and McCall of Texas as the respective committee chairs, those two guys understand the necessity of having a bipartisan agreement upon foreign policy, and they are adults. And I suspect we will see those kind of committees run significantly different than the kinds of committees that sort of are bent on polarization, like the oversight committee and judiciary. So yeah, I do think that there's a possibility. And you look also at Adam Smith and Mike Rogers of Armed Services, and you look at Turner, who's likely to be the chairman of Intel. You're not going to be particularly happy about Adam Schiff, but he's going to be a guy who understands there's a necessity for bipartisan cooperation and understanding and committee among his committee members. So all of that is to say we'll have some change. Again, though, it's going to take the president to do it. And my concern is that I think President Biden missed the opportunity. He got too concerned with becoming more transformational in his image than Barack Obama. and less concerned with the issue of, let's find a way to unify the country like I led everybody to believe I would.
We do seem to be able to be bipartisan when it's out of the headlines, and various stuff gets done. But I do want to take the combination of our two questions here. So what's going on with the midterms? This ought to be a T-ball home run. Why is it even close? Along with where we're going to go, and it seems to be Republicans in particular need a set of ideas that are both politically effective and true. The intersection of those ideas is difficult. I'll challenge you guys on the Semiconductor Chips Act, $250 billion down a rat hole of industrial policy to turn this into something on the effect of our shipbuilding industry is probably not a great idea. But there's lots of other places that what is the Republican Party going to stand for? Now, of course, number one, we got to get rid of that gallstone named Trump. Now, I don't mean to insult any of our readers, but Trump and Trump's causes will not win. So long as you're infused with Trump's various vendettas, that party's not going to go anywhere. But what are the ideas that it will offer the American people? It should be a layup. The schools are a disaster. Crime is going up. Inflation is like it hasn't been since 1971. There's this crazy climate policy being insinuated into every part of the federal government, its regulatory agencies, and you're seeing in gas prices exactly what that's going on. What are we offering them? Industrial policy, protection? What is there a hope of a resurgence of a set of coherent ideas to offer the American people that will attract them to what should be a blowout?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's a difference between policy and the politics of the moment. The politics of the moment, people beating up on, high prices and the open border and defund the police and nutty candidates who want to, take a third of the people out of prisons of Pennsylvania and say we're going to be safe. All that stuff's going on. What is not publicly visible and which has not been a key component of the fall election is what's the Republican agenda going forward.
Exactly.
Now, having said that, something remarkable has happened from of all people, Kevin McCarthy. Last August, a year ago, he appointed 13 committees. And he named the committees and the committee chairs and blah, blah. Each of them devoted to a single issue. And I took a look at it and I said, wait a minute. These chairs are by and large substantive people. Like the chairman of the committee on China is Mike McCall. The chairman of the committee on the economy is a Republican whom very few people have heard of, Patrick McHenry of North Carolina, who's a very serious member. Not only that, but all of the members of the committees are relatively substantive people. This is not the Matt Gaetz, Lori Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene wing of the Republican Party. These people are by and large the substantive members of the Committee of Jurisdiction. So on China, you have substantive members from the Intel, Armed Services, and the Ways and Means and Foreign Relations and Armed Services on the committee. On the economy, you have Financial Services, Ways and Means, Energy and Commerce, and so forth. So I got intrigued by this. So I started calling up some of the committee chairs whom I knew, and I said, am I misreading this? He actually wants you to come up with ideas about what you think we ought to do if we take the majority. Yep, that's right. And he wants you to have discussions with the people that you're going to have jurisdictional issues with, because a big part of getting an agenda going is figuring out what's going to fall under Energy and Commerce and what's going to be under Ways and Means. So he's got all the major players on these committees. So as you discuss this, you can sort of wrangle out some of these issues. Third of all, yep, that's right. I said, third of all, he's expecting this to come from the bottom up, not the top down. He's not looking for you to come in and say, what do you want us to do? He's saying to you, go out and discuss this area of issue and come up with what we ought to do. Oh, absolutely. And I said, well, that also sort of assumes that he wants this to be done in regular order. This is not going to be imposed from the top down, but come from the bottom up, which means you're going to have to do this through the subcommittee and then the full committee and bring it to the House floor, rather than having the speaker say, I am giving this blind. We are writing this in the speaker's office, blah. Everybody's got to vote for it. I said, absolutely. Otherwise, we wouldn't have taken it on. Now, I don't know if that eventually works out, but I think it will work out in some places. And the more that works out, the better, because that's a part of restoring the norms. Because look, again, I go back to the issue of look, and again, I'm not going to defend I'm not an industrial policy guy, but the fact of the matter is you had Democrats and Republicans saying, let's work this through in normal order. Can we find areas of agreement? Can we compromise on things and come up with something that we think directionally moves the country in a positive way? And I think that's going to happen in the House. And if you look, we will look back in January and say, look how many of the chairs of those committees ended up being chairs of actual committees and responsible for doing things. I bet you a dime to a dollar that McCall is chairman of House Foreign Relations and Patrick McHenry is chairman of Financial Services. I don't know who's going to be Ways and Means, but both of the guys who are being talked about for Ways and Means were both on some of those committees.
Carl, I want to ask you a real simple question, because some of this is like the technicalities of how Washington works, and we can feel some of our viewers getting a little bit, I don't know, distracted. So here's something simple.
Bored is what you meant to say, but
Conservative, so wonderful.
I'm very polite. Conservatism is changing. It used to be about economics, cutting taxes, rolling back the state, John Cochrane territory. That stuff doesn't work so well anymore.
Political.
Conservatism now is about culture. This is something that Ron DeSantis understands very well. And this is why he's the front runner, at least in the prediction markets, to be the Republican nominee. Long way to go, leave that aside. The British Conservatives have just proved that the old 1980s agenda of economic conservatism doesn't fly. In fact, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng have crashed their government more or less before it got off the runway, because they went for a radical tax cutting strategy that had no credibility with markets and ignored the advice that others gave them to focus on issues of education, issues of political correctness, the cultural issues, which people these days feel more strongly about, and where I think conservatives can win. Am I right in thinking that as we approach 2024, the way that Republicans should think is not it's the economy? They should actually focus on these cultural questions where they have a big chance of pulling voters, particularly Hispanic voters, but not only Hispanic voters, over from the Democratic side. How do you think about that big question, culture v. economics?
I think it shouldn't be either or. And it, frankly, in our moments of success has not been either or, it's been both. I mean, part of the reason that Reagan was successful was he was talking about several of the big social issues of the time: restoration of American confidence, and respect for law and order, and respect for limited government and for life. All of these things have both, and all of these things have implications, and many of them are not just social or economic, but are both. But we've always been a party where your successful message is one that is both economic and societal, and so but it waxes and wanes. I think by the time we get to 2024, I'm not an economist. I didn't even stay in Cochrane's guest room last night. But I think by 24, the economic issues are going to be important, because what's the likelihood of going through a recession? And the spending, they're not going to stop. We're going to stop the spending, but the inflation is going to take some time to wring out of the system. But are the economic issues subordinate to 2024 to societal issues? Maybe, but at minimum, that you have to emphasize both. Take a look at how these Senate races this year are coming together. Yes, they're pounding away at the rising cost and inflation and blah blah. But one of the things that has made Wisconsin and Pennsylvania move pretty dramatically in the Republican direction is a cultural issue, crime, because you have two lunatics on the Democratic tickets, respectively, in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, who've said extraordinarily bizarre things on the issue of law and order and crime and society that make them incredibly vulnerable. But a successful party in America has always been economic and non-economic. It's also been a party that has a strain of populism in it. And now populism is more, evident in both parties today than it's been. But if you go back, one of the things that made it successful for Ronald Reagan to take office was a belief that, that the pointy heads in Washington were thinking that America's best days were behind us, and that, they were all huddled around their fires in their cardigans, bemoaning the future of America. And so, be able to say the elites have got it wrong and the ordinary people of America will set it right, but was powerful then and remains powerful.
Karl, I'd like to continue on the cultural front for a minute. You're talking to four gentlemen who live under the yoke of Gavin Newsom in California.
My condolences. Come. You can be free in Texas.
Well, the governor seems more interested these days in your state, Texas and Florida, than he does California, and he's picking up cultural issues, abortion in particular. Two questions, Karl. Number one, when you look at Gavin Newsom, do you just see a California version of your friend Robert Francis O'Rourke? And then second question, do you think 2024, the near future of America, really is a referendum between how Californians live and are governed and how Floridians live and are governed?
Oh, I think that's a good way of putting it. The red state, blue state, and the epitome of red state is Florida or Texas, and the epitome of blue state is, Washington, Oregon, or California.
Yeah. But
yeah, I think Good Hair will be a significant candidate in the 2024 elections, and more power to him. It really is remarkable that Austin is being inundated with California economic refugees, and it's amazing. They say, "Oh my God, I got hell of a bigger house for a hell of a lot less money, and my paycheck seems to be bigger, even though my salary is exactly the same." But oh my God, I'm so glad to be here. Incidentally, how do I make Texas look like California? No. Please don't.
They bring their voting habits with them.
Actually, they're not. They're not. There's a very interesting study. I don't want to put too much in it because it's one survey done by a small firm, but they took 900 people who'd registered to vote in Texas for the first time since November of 2020. And they are something like, and I'm going to be off a little bit on these numbers, they're like 44% Republican, 28% Democrat, rest independent, and their planned vote, their generic ballot for this November is 59R 41D. And those are migrants, either migrants within Texas or migrants moving into Texas from other states.
Mm-hmm.
I had a weird, I'm not going to use his name because it'll be public, but there's a California tech billionaire who moved to Austin. He called me up and he said, "Would I come to lunch?" And I went to a lunch at his house west of Austin, and sitting around the table were four other California tech billionaires and a former Mexican national, now U.S. citizen who runs his family's companies, his family's empire from Austin, Texas. And I'm thinking, I remember in Austin when you could name everybody in town who had $1 million house, and we got 6 billionaires sitting around the table.
I can't imagine who you're talking about, Karl. It just completely eludes me. But let me say that I agree with you that the people who are moving to Texas are moving partly or largely because of disgust with California's dysfunctional politics. And it seems highly unlikely that those people would then be actively supportive of Democrats in Texas. On the contrary, I can think of some people who've made that move in the last couple of years who immediately set to work to tackle the problem of people living on the streets in Austin, because of course they'd seen what that policy had done to turn California at San Francisco into San Francisco. So let's talk, if we can, a little bit about the road to 2024. I had a question that only you can answer. If I were a Republican would-be nominee, would I want the Republicans to do really, really well in the midterms, or just so-so? I'm thinking that for them to do really well and take Senate and House might actually make life more difficult for a candidate in 2024 than for us to have divided government. Am I right about that?
I think that's right. I'm not certain it's good for the country to have divided government. A Republican House and a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president for the next couple of years. But you're right. If you've got a Republican Senate and a Republican House, the expectation of the American people that they do something constructive is there, and B, they won't be able to get as much done as some people might expect, and C, they might do things that the presidential candidate says is not helpful to their general election messaging. On the other hand, it's going to be what it's going to be, and I'd frankly, over the next 2 years, from the perspective of policy, I'd rather have a Republican House and a Republican Senate, because it would allow us to keep the Biden administration from doing as much damage to the economy and to the country as possible. And it would also begin to lay the predicate for a Republican president to come in and unite not just govern on the basis of, Republican or Democrat. I'm a Republican. I've got a Republican House and Senate, but to say I'm a Republican president, I should have confidence that I can work across party lines on things of common good where we can.
Second question, and then I'll hand over to John and HR. We talked a lot on this show recently about the 1970s and how we're sort of rerunning it economically and in other ways too. And I've certainly said more than once that I sometimes think the Biden administration is the Carter administration with dementia, and that therefore this will be a one-term presidency. The question is, does it end the way that the Carter presidency did, not only with stagflation and quote unquote malaise, but also with a sense of massive international crisis? I mean, let's not forget the Iranian Revolution, the invasion of Afghanistan. It felt like things were really blowing up, and all attempts at détente had ended in failure. Those things paved the way for Ronald Reagan and a transformational presidency, a really transformational one, unlike the fake transformational one we have at the moment. Can you imagine a scenario in which the late 70s play out and we end up with a 1980 type election in 2024? Or is this just the wrong analogy?
No, I think it's a great analogy. I'm not certain so much about the 1980 election and the aftermath of it is based in the personality and the leadership of Ronald Reagan. But yeah, I see similarities. I was the young kid, incidentally. People forget this. In 1980, I was the executive director of the Texas Victory Committee for Reagan Bush. That was the unified campaign led by our governor, Bill Clements. We'd had a brief period of time during which we had not elected a Republican governor or a statewide constitutional officer 114 years. And Clements came in 1978 and made the defeat of Jimmy Carter a prime goal of his. People forget Texas was a battleground state. We were one of the 10 battleground states of the 1980 presidential election. And I happened to office in downtown Austin, and I look out and down on the governor's mansion, and just north of the governor's mansion is a parking lot, and then an office building, an apartment building called the Westgate that overlooks the Capitol. That parking lot was the site of a funeral home, and that was where our campaign headquarters was. I had to take a draining table and remove it from my office before it could become my office. But yeah, the late 70s could be today again, and they could end in the same way. It'll be different because he was in so many ways sui generis. But I'd use that Latin word for HR. I know he's the
We're always lapsing into Latin on GoodFellows.
That scenario depends a lot on what happens abroad. It's amazing how quickly we forgot losing a war in Afghanistan. But if Ukraine stabilizes or ends, and hopefully with the Ukrainians winning and hasn't blown up, and if Xi doesn't invade Taiwan, that outcome, or on the other hand, we could be still bleeding in Ukraine, and Xi could have a embargo around Taiwan, and then all of a sudden you're in that situation. So that puts a lot of the agency for what happens into those particular flashpoints. I want to hope, actually, I'm still rankling at Neil's insults to economists. I actually want to hope that economics is not part of the politics. Liz Truss, her economics is actually right. It's just miserably sold and was not the political rallying point. I think you're right, actually. It would be lovely if economics could be sort of a thing of technical competence in the background. And right now, in fact, the cultural issues, what's going on in your schools, what's going on in the forced DEI training in your work, the sense that the elites are completely incompetent, the sense that the government is completely incompetent, the FDA and the CDC, the politicization of everything that should be just running at least like the DMV, which runs badly, but not politically. I do think that if you want to be political, I want to cheer for economics not being a central part of the political message, because then it's more likely to be competently run.
I mean, I think inflation is going to be a big issue, unless I'm completely wrong. My sense is that the Federal Reserve is going to blink, just like the Bank of England did a few days ago, at the first sign of financial trouble. At the first sign of financial trouble, that the whole "I am Paul Volcker" script is going to be discarded. And just like Arthur Burns in the 70s, Jay Powell will not bring inflation back under control. But I think that I could be wrong about that. They may prove me wrong and get away with it. But I think if inflation is still an issue going into 2024, it's bound to be a big issue with the voters.
Well, either inflation is going to be an issue or the recession is going to be an issue. And,
right.
The recession is going to cause an explosion of what are you doing? Plus, it's going to cause an explosion of bailouts, right, left, and center. It's the federal budget is going to be a huge problem. So one way or another, there is going to be enough economics that somebody like a Ronald Reagan who could turn that into a politically viable message could do a great job with it.
Well,
but HR will tell us how it'll all come out sunny.
Yeah. Aren't we sort of replaying history? Because, I mean, Volcker did not start on January 20th, 1981. He began several years before, and Reagan didn't come in and have the first 2 years were not economically successful. We got our teeth handed to us in 1982 in the midterms, in part because the economy was so bad. Now, on the other hand, it made for a great television by early 1984 when it was A Morning in America, because the economy was roaring back. But I look at the time frame and say, this is like last time, only worse, because the inflation began in 2021, and they begin to ratchet up interest rates in 2022. So we've got potentially recession next year and bad news going into the presidential election.
There was 3 waves of inflation in the 1970s. We don't get to just necessarily jump to 1979. We probably get 1972, 1975.
Well, you're forgetting that we whipped inflation now, as I recall, with those brilliant buttons, Jerry Ford. Exactly. I got one lying around here someplace.
HR, you're being very quiet. You must be thinking of some very clever Latin phrase.
Well, I mean, I'm not the domestic politics guy, obviously, but what I'd like to ask you, Karl, is where do we get somebody who's more of a unifier, who can get to the politics of addition instead of doubling down on narrow and relatively extreme political bases? Can it occur in America today with our primary system? I mean, how do we get leaders, to run for office and then to succeed, who are determined, to represent all of Americans?
Yeah. Well, getting to run is not the difficult thing, because anybody who occupies a high office in America in this environment is going to think of themselves as a potential president, and they're going to be eager to run. The question is whether they see a path to victory, and that depends on their vision and the climate of the times and the nature of the party. But look, it's amazing. Last year, on May 7th, we had about 500 people in Austin, Texas, who had contributed money to our voter identification and voter registration get out the vote effort. We had 5 billionaires sitting in the front row, and they heard from the following people. I'm going to list them in alphabetical order. That was not the order they appeared, but they heard from Chris Christie, Tom Cotton, Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, Marco Rubio, Rick Scott, and Tim Scott, each of whom was interviewed for 45 minutes by a member of the Texas congressional delegation, all of whom took their responsibilities seriously. One of the best political meetings I've ever been to in my life. And afterwards, when all the luminaries had flown away and people were having their getaway drink on the patio outside, the message was, God, we have a bench, we have a team, we have real talent. And we're going to do that again next year to reward the people who've underwritten the voter registration, get out the vote effort. And I'm confident we've got a lot of people who want to run. I mean, Nikki Haley wanted to come that day, but couldn't because her daughter was graduating from college. We just had Glenn Youngkin here in Austin, who met with a group of Republicans during the Texas Trib Fest. Now, people walked away saying, "Oh my God, look at that." There's a talk about Ferguson's education guy. I mean, he talked about combating wokeism in education and to doing what he could on diversity to unleash some of the powers of meritocracy. So we got a lot of people out there, and I think a lot of them are going to necessarily offer themselves up because they see 2024 as a real opportunity.
Karl, I don't think a show in which Donald Trump is referred to as a Goldstone would be complete if someone didn't at least stick up a bit for Donald Trump. After all, the economy under Trump was a real rip-roaring success, with full employment, with low inflation, with gains for lower income earners, gains for minorities. Median household income inflation adjusted up 9% by 2019, better performance than all the previous 15, 16 years. I'm wondering if we're making a mistake in talking about American politics and not talking about him, because although he wasn't at your audition there in Texas, he is still in prediction markets just behind DeSantis to be the nominee. And, I ask myself, are the elites, and let's face it, we're part of the elite, are we making the 2016 mistake of underestimating Trump's ability to be the nominee and indeed to win the election? I'm very struck on my peregrinations to such bastions of elitism as Aspen by the fact that the elites seem to be having the exact same thoughts about Trump that they had in 2016. And yet his net approval is better than it was when he won in November of 2016. Karl, is he down and out, or should we all take very seriously, whatever we think of him, Goldstone or hero, that he could make a comeback and be the second president since Grover Cleveland to get 2 non-consecutive terms?
Well, I think he could become the Republican nominee if he wanted to. I don't think the Democrats, though, are going to be so stupid as to nominate the one person in America who could lose to Donald Trump as they did in 2016. I mean, Hillary Clinton ran one of the worst campaigns I've ever seen in my life and demonstrated a tone deafness to the American electorate that is just appalling. Here's a woman who's running television ads in Texas weeks before she lost the general election, depriving the necessary funds in states like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania that they needed to win in a hopeless effort to try and swing Texas. And, so I don't underestimate his ability to win the nomination, but I don't think time is going to be his ally. You now have people running campaigns and they're running polls in their states and districts and finding out he's not that popular. They're finding that he's an impediment to the victory. He's not going to have all these election deniers, the candidates for Secretary of State of Nevada and Arizona and Michigan and Attorney General in Michigan and Arizona. I think they're unlikely to win. And we have 85 members of the Texas House of Representatives. I was looking at the numbers a year ago. All 85 of them got a higher percentage of the vote in their district than did Donald Trump, the leader of the ticket. And then I was out at one of the elites weekend getaway places, Bohemian Grove, and George Will, I happened to mention this in the presence of George Will, and he said, what about other states? So I went and looked, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, virtually every one of them, it's the same thing. The bottom of the ticket is running ahead of the top of the ticket. And you take all the difficulties we have this year, I think the oath keepers in trials are going to continue to unsettle a lot of people, and I think we're also going to have people who say, you know what, I appreciate all the good things that he did, but I want somebody who will be able to serve 2 terms as president, not somebody who's just running in order to, seek revenge for having lost the last one and can serve for 4 years and is 78 years old. We're at one of those moments, like 1960, where Dwight Eisenhower is the last president born before World War I, and Kennedy and Nixon are the first 2 candidates who served in World War II in low-level positions. Eisenhower is sort of the leave of that great generation that led the fight in World War II, and Kennedy and Nixon are 2 of the first generation who were the grunts and the frontliners. And then we came along after Reagan, after Nixon, after Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and 41, we have another generational change, and suddenly along comes the baby boomers with Clinton and Bush and Obama and then Trump, and now I think we're gonna have another generational change, and it's going to for the country. Since
I was the guy who said the gallstone crack, I do want to clarify. There was some great policy achievements under Trump. There were some major mistakes.
Mostly while H.R. McMaster was in the White House.
While H.R. McMaster was in the White House, but. My view is, which I want to, this is actually a question because it depends on polling, is that I don't care what you think about Trump's claims about the election, yes or no, but there's a vast, the elections hinge on the independents in the middle. We know what Trump's types will do. We know what the woke left will do. What matters is the independents in the middle who swing one way or another. and Trump's behavior toward the U.S. Constitution from the election, not just January 6th, but from the election on, refusing to, the one thing we do is peaceful transfer of power. There's 5% crucial that are just never going to vote for the guy no matter what. So that's why I viewed. And then if you want to win, there comes a point where even if you're right, even if you truly believe that Trump, that it was stolen and fraud and so forth, it's not going to win. That 5% is not going to vote for Trump. So it's a losing cause.
Well, it's more than 5%. I mean, recent polls at 47% of Republicans want him to be the nominee. That's down 20 points in less than a year. And we now have 1 out of every 6 Republicans who think he ought to be indicted over something to do is mishandling of classified information. So what gets me is that if you look at independents, they look on issues of like, inflation, the economy, crime, border security. They look much more like Republicans than they do Democrats. But when you come to the issue of Trump, they look less Republican and slightly more Democrat in their outlook on these kind of issues.
Can I ask you a question about, we've been focused on electoral politics. Phil Gramm was with us recently, and he said something very deep. He said, the problem with Washington is the Democrats love government, so they're really good at it. And they get in and they know how to change the levers. They know how to run a coup of an administrative agency and put all the right people in. Republicans hate government, so they get in and they're no good at it. But you talked about a bench of politicians. I certainly see the twisting of the administrative agencies. We don't really bother passing laws anymore. We just have executive orders. Can Republicans, is there a bench also that can turn around the administrative state and undo some of the deeply entrenched stuff going on there?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think the Supreme Court is going to have a great deal to do on that. And it's going to help us because it's going to undo Chevron deference and instead say you actually have to pass a law. But let me give a little bit, as we head out here, a little bit of credit to Trump. Bernie Marcus, of all people, shows up in 2015 and says to Stephen Law and me at the Senate Leadership Fund American Crossroads, we got all these red rules and regulations and we need to have a strategy to undo them. And I'll put a gigantic sum of money into developing a game plan. And we said, we don't need the gigantic sum of money. We need a modest sum of money. And we proceeded to get 2 young guys who stepped in and reached out to all the general counsels of every department and agency during the Bush years and to the degree that they were still around, the 41 and Reagan years, and basically said, help us develop a roadmap for all the bad regulations and how to go about undoing them. This ended up in 2 gigantic notebooks. Bernie Marcus forces his way onto the plane in 2015, in July of 2015, and tells Trump he needs to adopt this plan. Trump adopts the plan. All of the landing teams during the transition had their agency's book with them and instructions on how to begin it. He brought in the kid, and I say kid, he was in his 30s at the time, and makes him the domestic policy chief to make certain that this all gets done. And of course, that's one of the great success stories is they came in and they knew which ones to get rid of by Congressional Regulatory Act, which ones they could withdraw, which ones they could resubmit, blah, 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 the whole kit and caboodle. And it was one of the great successes of the Trump administration in that the regulatory burden went back down pretty dramatically. And 2 years into it, the kid gets rewarded by being moved from the Domestic Policy Council to the United States ambassador to UN organizations in Geneva with the nicest residence of an ambassador probably in the world, because we bought it in the 20s when we thought the League of Nations was going to be in Geneva. But yeah, the bottom line is, yes, there are lots of people out there who've now been tenured either in the Trump administration or 43's administration who are and a lot in the legal community because of the Federalist Society and other activities who are ready to take on the regulatory state if they're given the opportunity.
So, Karl, we have to go. Normally on GoodFellows, we avoid predictions. You can see John Cochrane just bristled at the thought of doing predictions. So I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you for a prediction, Karl. The morning of November the 9th, the day after the election, tell me what the headline's going to be in the Austin American-Statesman. And then secondly, Karl, be it a Senate race, a House race, a gubernatorial race, give us a surprise outcome, something we'll be saying we should have seen that one coming.
Headline in the Austin American-Statesman will be dark evening. Robert Francis O'Rourke loses again. The surprise, I'll give you 2 potential surprises. Republicans take the governorship of the state of Oregon for the first time since 1982. And the Colorado Senate race is unexpectedly close. And maybe with the election of Joe O'Dea, one of the two best Republican candidates in the country, the other being Tiffany Smiley of Washington State. The only problem is they're both running in very tough territory.
Very good. Niall Ferguson, get this man a University of Austin ball cap, will you?
Yeah, there we go.
Yes, the University of Austin, I'm glad to report, is taking shape rapidly. And so I will be spending some more time in Texas, Carl. You'll be glad to hear, because this is a good example of how America works. When there's a problem, create a new institution. And if you want to do it in Texas.
Yeah. So before you come to Texas next time, let me know and we'll have a little dinner party so you can meet some prospective donors to the University of Austin.
Would love that. And I need to buy some cowboy boots.
Sorry, don't forget that Hoover Institution ball cap and good existing institutions.
And maybe
Some
a
of
good
our colleagues.
Look, Condi has me doing some event in Dallas. Can you at least make her promise to give me a Hoover ball cap? I mean, drag my sorry posterior up to Dallas to meet with a bunch of your young leaders. And I mean, how come nobody says no to that woman? I mean, why do we all say yes? Why are we all so cowed by that woman? I want to know.
But the answer is now you know why she's the boss.
Yeah, exactly.
And on that
cowboy hats.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up this week's episode of GoodFellows. Fear not, we'll be back with at least one or two more episodes before the November election. If you want to find out when we're on the air, very simple, subscribe to us. And while you're there, rate us, give us a nice review, leave some stars. Very simple. 3 stars in honor of H.R. McMaster, add a star for John, add a star for Neil, 5 stars. We'll take them. You can also sign up for Hoover's Daily Report, which delivers the best work of Neil, John, and H.R. to your inbox weekdays. On behalf of Hoover's GoodFellows, Niall Ferguson, John Cochrane, H.R. McMaster, our guest today, Karl Rove. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. We'll see you soon. Till then, take care.
If you enjoyed this show and are interested in watching more content featuring H.R. McMaster, watch Battlegrounds, also available at hoover.org.